our program on Indian poetry, past, present, and future, organized by the Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library, Kolkata, or as we say, IPPL. We have been having these series of programs since the lockdown began, since we have been stuck in our respective homes, learning to deal with the pandemic and all the paraphernalia that came along with it, holding on in these very strange times, trying to learn up new ways to negotiate, to navigate through this maze of life as it stands right now. The Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library has been around for over 2 years now, 2.5 years actually, officially, but we have been there even before that, before we got registered. We functioned from the library space of the ICCR Kolkata. However, since March, we have been on the online mode. And though we miss our programs at the ICCR, however, we are trying to make the most of it by organizing these programs where we have poets, where we have guests from all over the globe joining us. And I think that is the one advantage of having these online programs. So I welcome all of you to our this edition of Indian poetry, past, present, and future. And our guest, our poet guest for today is Tabish Khair, who joins us from Denmark. Before we go on to talk about Khair and listen to him talking about his poetry and reading his poems, I would request the Vice President of the Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library, Dr. Joydeep Sharungi, to deliver the welcome address. Dr. Joydeep Sharungi is a well-known poet, translator. He is the Vice President, as I said, of the Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library, and is also the principal of New Alipur College. I would now request Joydeep to deliver the welcome address. Joydeep.
Thank you, Honorable Secretary and Dr. Nishi Kulagurta. It's a wonderful evening in Kolkata and maybe afternoon, it's early afternoon in Europe. And we have had with us great poets like Keki, Darwala, Mamang Dai, there we had GJB Prasad, Shubodh Sarkar, who's delivered talks on poetry, and they moved our hearts with their beautiful poems in our previous lectures in the same series. Tabish needs no introduction. He is a name by himself. And I have possibly read his two books more than 5 times. One is Babu Fiction and Night of Happiness. As a wonderful man, a versatile genius, journalist, novelist, poet, and what more. And for Tabish, parallel lines meet. Actually, his book is Where the Parallel Lines Meet. And I say, for Tabish, parallel lines meets. You make things happen. And his poem, I'm reminded of Amma, where he says, I hear your footsteps, grandmother, echo or pause. All curtains have long been taken down. A moving poem. We need to go back to the poem again and again. As the more we read, we go back to our past and we go back to our tradition. It's written with a delicate, sensitive touch, a brush. That's the did. We are all looking forward to this particular evening where Tabish will be speaking on poetry and what makes, what are the things important for poetry and the reception of poetry. And he will be reading his own poems. We are very fortunate that we have with us the chief ideator of IPPL, Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library. It was the brainchild of Professor Bashabi Fraser from Edinburgh. Welcome, Bashabidi. We always look forward to your guidance. We welcome the advisory board members, others like Keki Darwala, Anjanadi, and many others who are present in this evening. We welcome all the participants and the members of IPPL who are making things happen. And IPPL is never stopped. Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library is committed to bring poetry to the heart of the nation. To the heart of the nation is a phrase taken from Bashavi Fraser's Madam. Actually, we are committed to poetry. Poetry is a lifeline. Our hearts are red with one thing, that is poetry. That's why, without any delay, without any further extension of thoughts, I welcome Tabish Khair, who needs no introduction, as the chief speaker and the poet for today's evening. Welcome all the audience who are present here. Thank you. Over to Nishi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joydeep. I think everyone is waiting for our program to begin, and we would love to hear Tabish speak. And before we begin, I mean, though Tabish needs no introduction, however, I would formally introduce Tabish to our audience. And our audience who have joined us here on Zoom. We are also live on Facebook at this point of time. And I would request everyone, excepting the speakers, everyone to please mute your audio. It disturbs otherwise. And we will be having a question answer session after Tabish. Tabish speaks first, he reads his poem, and after that, we will be having a question answer session. And as Tabish himself has said, it would be convenient if you could key in your questions in the Zoom chat box. We would also be taking questions from the Facebook, from our Facebook audience as well. And we'll be copying them out here as well into the Zoom chat box. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Tabish Khair. Tabish was born in 1966 and he was born and educated in Gaya. His bio says a small town in Bihar, but you know, the moment we say Gaya, we have a different feel about the place. You know, when I read your bio, it said a small town. And for me, Gaya is not a small town, it's just Gaya. I mean, it evokes so much, that very name. He is the author of critically acclaimed books, including novels, Filming a Love Story, The Thing About Thugs, How to Fight Islamic Terror from the Missionary Position, Just Another Jihadi Jain, and poetry collections Where Parallel Lines Meet and Man of Glass. His studies include the Gothic, post-colonialism and otherness, and the new xenophobia. He is the winner of the All India Poetry Prize. His novels have been shortlisted for more than a dozen major prizes, including the Man Asian, the DSC Prize, the Sahitya Academy Award, and the Encore. An associate professor at Aarhus University, Denmark, he has been a Leverhulme guest professor at Leeds University, UK, and has held fellowships at JNU Delhi University, Hong Kong City University, and the Hong Kong Baptist University in China. Also at York University and Cambridge University, among others. He recently published a poetry pamphlet titled Quarantine Sonnets on the pandemic, with profits being donated to a migrant worker charity. And just a few days ago, I was not reading to some of the quarantine sonnets, but I got to hear a number of Shakespeare scholars read the quarantine sonnets, and I found it a fascinating experience altogether. And I'm sure during today's poetry reading, Tabish would probably read a couple of them as well. So it is over now to you, Tabish. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishi, for this kind introduction. Thank you to Jaideep, to your organization, and to all of you there, including fellow poets and writers who have found the time to be here. I could see Bashabi is there. I could see Keki Daruwala, one of our most important writers and poets, is also there. And I'm touched by the fact that that all of you have found time to check out my reading. Particularly so because I haven't really done a poetry reading for ages. I did a few for Kitab when Quarantine Sonnets was published. But apart from that, as a poetry reading session, I tend to be invited more as a novelist and as an academic. And there's good reason for that. I haven't really been writing that much poetry. My first important or significant collection, if you ask me, was published more than 20 years ago, Where Parallel Lines Meet. And then I published one 10 years after that in 2010, Man of Class. And then I published maybe 6 or 7 or 10 poems on demand in different anthologies. The last one being an anthology that's just been released, A Thousand Cranes for India. And then, of course, Quarantine Sonnets. So obviously, I have not been writing that much poetry in the last 10, 12 years. The reason for that is simple from my perspective, and it might be of interest to you, because Jaideep told me that I should speak about my own poetry for about 15, 20 minutes and then read for 20 minutes. So that's what I'm going to do. And speaking about my own poetry is always a difficult task. I hate speaking about my own writing. So I'll speak about things around them. And I think one of the reasons I've not been able to write poetry is that I find it very difficult to combine an academic career with poetry. I can combine it with long fiction, but short stories and poems for me demand the kind of intense effort over a period of time without too many distractions that academic life does not permit. And again, in the case of poetry, language is also a very important factor. It's always a factor with creative writing. You need to move away from academic discourse, but poetry is more demanding for me. But of course, that's only me. There are a lot of very good academics who are also good poets. So obviously, it depends on the kind of poetry you write or the kind of person you are. Um, the thing about poetry for me, and I think because I have to talk about poetry, and as I said, I'm not going to really talk about my own poetry too much. I'll read it out to you and let you listen to it. And if you want to talk about it, I'll be happy to answer your questions if I can. But I think one of the reasons why it's difficult for me to write poetry while being enmeshed in bureaucratic, administrative, and academic work is the very nature of poetry. Now, as some critics and poets have pointed out, perhaps the only thing that distinguishes poetry from prose is that the poet decides where his or her lines would end on the page in the case of poetry. For instance, if you take say my novel Night of Happiness and look at any of the pages, it's obvious that I haven't decided where they will end. It's the printer, it's the typesetter who has decided where they will end. But when one looks at a collection of poems, obviously I have decided where the lines would end. Now, of course, there are lots of poems where this doesn't happen, many kinds of prose poetry where it doesn't happen. But even in those poems, there's something that is similar to poetry that is written in, I wouldn't call it the traditional way, but I would say the mainstream way, maybe, where lines are broken up, chopped up. And they're chopped up for a number of reasons. But the main reason for me is that it focuses attention on certain aspects of language and expression more effectively, or in a different way at least, than we are able to when we have prose that goes on and on. Of course, this can be used in creative ways. Last year, a very good novel by Bernardine Evaristo won the Booker Prize, or was the co-winner. And in that novel, she does exactly this. She uses this trick of poetry to focus attention on certain ways of saying things. So what I'm trying to say is that poetry for me does something that all of literature does. It uses language. It uses language's relationship to reality and reality's language in a very conscious manner, in a very sensitive and acute manner. And for that, one obviously needs to have a kind of concentration, a kind of contemplative and intellectual approach to poetry that sometimes I find difficult to cultivate when I am being distracted by other kinds of affairs. Um, so that is how I write poetry. And now, one of the things that sometimes I'm asked, and I think some of you I can see are younger people, and which means that you're probably struggling poets or aspiring poets yourself, and you might have asked this question because this is a question that I've been asked by young people doing creative writing courses and things like that, which sometimes I'm supposed sometimes asked to address these audiences as a guest. And one of the questions that they often ask me is, how do I write? They say, I look out there and there's so much stuff there, and then I'm working on my own little thing, and how do I write? How do I know that I'm doing anything worth being put out there? And what I tell them is what I realized when I was a young person, and I realized that the only way to, for me at least, to do it is to be aware of as much of what's out there as one can be. You can never be aware of everything, but I would say some of the interesting things in your field. If you're a poet, then some of the important poets who went before you and who are also writing along with you. Because creative writing is a kind of magic wall. It's a wall that is totally full of different tiles, and they're wondrous tiles, and there's no space on that wall. You look at it and you see the wall full of these different tiles, each one unique in its own way. And you are working on your little tile, and you can see that there's no space on that wall for your little tile. But it's a magic wall. So what you do is, if you look at it long enough and close enough, then a space opens up. And that little space is the space for your little tile. So if that helps those of you who are aspiring young poets, I think that is something to keep in mind. And what I'm trying to say is that the only way to write poetry for me, or to write literature for me, is to read poetry and read literature. And of course, also to live life as much as one can, because as I said, literature is a particular relationship of language to reality and reality to language, both affecting each other. So I hope I have said something for about 10-15 minutes about poetry and my own poetry. And after that, I'll move on to a short reading. Uh, I will ask you when I think I have exhausted your patience and my 20-25 minutes. And if you feel that I have read for less, because sometimes it's difficult to keep track, and I've been looking for the time slot on my laptop and I can't find it right now. So anyway, I'll ask you, and if you want me to read more, I can read more. Now, because I've been asked to read recent poetry, I won't really be reading from Where Parallel Lines Meet. It came out 20 years ago, and as far as I know, it's out of print. But I think it would be unfortunate not to read at all from from this collection. So I'll just read out a short poem which says something about poetry, or about the way I see poetry, something that I have left out. It's called The Other Half of Kabir's Doha. The Other Half of Kabir's Doha. Now that the world has proved porous, how will we ever separate the dagger from the skull? Who, having gathered up the broken pieces of a voice, will speak in his own voice, or her own voice, or the voice of his mother? Who will follow you now, Kabir, from the marketplace of defeats, through the song of protests, to that hut where King of Kings came without his crown? Who will turn the oceans to ink, all the forest trees to quill, and still fail to inscribe earth? Who will whittle the world to songs and keep wisdom from words? Who will be willing to be torn between two final truths and turn flower? And yet, When I think of this world which has turned porous, I recall the time I watched a line from your dohas, Kabir, struggling to set it free from the prison of a book, and heard my grandfather's wordless cook casually complete your couplet. Uh, Now I'll move on to a more recent collection, Man of Glass, which I think is still available. And this is a collection that's thank you, Nishi. And this is a collection that is divided up into three sections. The first section is the rewriting of Kalidas's Shakuntala, aspects of it. The second section is contains transcriptions of Ghalib's ghazals, some of them. And the third section contains rewritings of H.C. Andersen's stories, what we very often call fairy tales, The Little Mermaid and all the rest. The reason I chose these three writers was, even though I didn't do it consciously, when I started writing these poems, I gravitated towards writers who have influenced me, who have shaped who I am, also culturally. Kalidas, obviously, one of the greatest of writers, one of the greatest of our writers and world writers. Ghalib, again, one of the greatest of our writers and world writers, writing in Urdu and Farsi. Farsi, of course, I don't know Urdu. I can read with a lot of effort because I read Hindi. I have studied Hindi, but of course, I speak good Urdu, and I can even understand some Persianized Urdu if it's spoken to me. And then, of course, H.C. Andersen. I mean, when I wrote these poems in 2009, 2010, I had been in Denmark for 10 years, and I started feeling like, well, now I'm going to be here for perhaps the rest of my life. By then, I had two children growing up in Denmark, and once you have children in a culture, that culture becomes part of your culture, at least then, if not before. So these three came together. Now I'll read out only the poems based on H.C. Andersen's fairy tales or shorter stories, because they are more easy to read out as separate ones. Both Ghalib's and Kalidas's need more extensive reading. Now, you would remember this fairy tale by H.C. Andersen called The Tinderbox. This is a soldier returning after war, and he meets a witch, an old woman, a weird woman, next to a hollow tree, and this witch asks him to go into the hollow of the tree, descend there, and get certain things, and then obviously various things happen to him. Now, basically, this is a poem that takes that story and reads it at a slant. It's based on the Tinderbox, H.C. Andersen's. H.C. I'm sorry, I've been in Denmark so long, I'm pronouncing it the Danish way. It's not in Danish, it's Andersen, but of course in English it's H.C. Andersen. The soldier home from Iraq. What could I do being what I was? Savior of all women, their killer too. On my chest there sat a big dog, trained to get answers. Move it, jump, jump, jump. I picked up my M16A2 and shot her. There she lay, there they lay. Back home I was rich like anyone else. Princesses clutched my dog hairs in fantasy and ecstasy. Later we slept. I had my will until the shades of a prison house closed upon me, and I remembered I'd forgotten something. It eludes me still. Was it a candle, a wick, a tinderbox? Something to do with light, surely. Something that would have set me free. Uh, I'll continue with this. And obviously, you can see that written in 2009, 2010, these are poems dealing with what was happening around us in those years. I think I will read these two poems, um, which I have read before, though, but still. The first one is based on The Little Mermaid. Now, I don't need to remind you of The Little Mermaid. All of us are familiar with the story, at least with the Disney version of the story turned into film. But my poem is called Immigrant. It hurts to walk on new decks. The curse of consonants, the wobble of vowels. And you for whom I gave up a kingdom can never love that thing I was. When you look into my past, you see only weeds and scales. Once I had a voice, now I have legs. Sometimes I wonder, was it fair trade? The next one is again based on another very well-known story by H.C. Andersen, The Snow Queen, or The Ice Queen. I think it's written, translated as The Snow Queen or Ice Queen. And if I remember correctly, British versions have it as Snow Queen, and American versions have it as The Ice Queen. Whatever that tells us. And my poem is divided into, like, as is the case with the story, which is divided into 6 parts. My poem is divided into 6 couplets, and it's called Couplets in Ice. Couplets in Ice. 1. The walls of your palace are made of snow. The game of reason is cold and slow. 2. You cannot tell your love apart. The queen of ice sits in your heart. 3. How well we understand in tongues unknown the word that in English is pronounced alone. 4. Always the crow knows where your love went, though he speaks harshly and with an accent. 5. How soon it happened just a while ago. You held my hand and walked in sand or snow. 6. The last story cannot be told. Its words were patented and sold. Yeah, well, why not? These two along similar lines. This one is based on another famous story, very commonly read story by H.C. Andersen called The Hardy Tin Soldier. Remember, where there's this tin soldier that falls in love with a ballet dancer in a glass globe. Okay. Thank you for your kind comments, by the way. I can see them pop up and sometimes I miss them, but thank you. And so this poem is based on the hardy tin soldier, and it's called Tinker. Tinker. Always in the end what remains is melted and twisted. Once he was a man. He stood once, he washed, sailed in boats of paper. He had a scrape or two with death and disaster. The love he knew, like all love, was a little beyond reach. Sometimes he stood fast in the face of danger. Sometimes he evaded tax. Goblins warned him, rats chased him. He floated on furious waters, recovered. A dancer once waited for him all night. Did he have a heart of tin all along? Or did tin happen to him like it happens to so many of us? If the good old dancer were alive, surely she would tell. Okay, I'll read just one more very short poem from this, which is based on The Princess on the Pea. And I don't need to remind you of The Princess on the Pea. This is a princess who comes in and is tested by being made to sleep on all these mattresses with right at the bottom. But my poem is called Refugee. Refugee. Who can tell her identity? The gold, the silk mattress, such a stuff, are noble and yet not enough. Where is the blasted pea? Uh, Now, because Nishi has asked me to read from Quarantine Sonnets, Quarantine Sonnet, I keep on getting confused how to pronounce that word. I will move on to Quarantine Sonnets. And if later you want me to read something else, I'll be happy to oblige, because obviously there's going to be a big shift now. Quarantine sonnets are ironic, are very often satires, and they happened as a kind of fluke. When Denmark went into lockdown, finally, like all countries, we tried to ignore what was happening despite warnings for 3 months because it wasn't good for our share market. So finally, we went into a lockdown. Thank you, Jaideep. You want me to read Amma? Okay, I'll end by reading Amma then, because that's from Parallel Lines Meet, which would be nice actually. Take me back home. So, when we went into this lockdown, a friend of mine who's a Shakespeare scholar, she asked me whether I would want to write a paper on Shakespeare's sonnets. And I said, well, I need to reread the sonnets. I've read them 2, 3, 4 times in the past too, but I hadn't read them for a few years. So I said, I need to reread them and see whether I have anything to say at all. So I started rereading the sonnets, and because I was stuck at home, we couldn't go anywhere, just for the heck of it, I rewrote 1 or 2 of his sonnets with the pandemic in mind, and sent it to this friend. I said, I think I'm having more trouble doing more fun doing this than actually writing an academic paper. And she said, oh, but these are good. Are you going to write more? And I said, why not? I mean, give me something to to concentrate on. So I started doing about 1 sonnet every day, every second day, and that went on for 20 days or 24 days or something like that. I think, I think 21 days, 3 weeks actually, 21. So more than 21 days, but about 24, 25 days. I stopped after 21 sonnets. And then, of course, in the beginning, the first 4 or 5 sonnets are more like jokes with Shakespeare. For instance, the first one plays on the common claim that Shakespeare makes about how his poems are going to make his beloved immortal, and this is the beloved basically not totally convinced and saying, well, but how much are you making as royalties? How much are you making as a writer? So it just starts like that. But from the 6th or 7th poem, it takes a darker and more satirical turn, with the pandemic becoming its central concern. I'll And of course, as is the case with Shakespeare sonnets, the way I see Shakespeare sonnets, because of course Shakespeare sonnets are read as Shakespeare himself is speaking. But I think Shakespeare does something that he does also in his plays. He protects himself. He creates voices and personas. So he's there, but he's also not there at the same time. So you have different voices in Shakespeare's sonnets too. And I just take it further, and all my sonnets have different voices. So in one case, there's the voice of a very well-known global leader who is famous for his tweets, and even some of the lines contain his tweets. I'll see if I can find that. I might as well start off by reading that. Yeah, and this is based on one of the most commonly anthologized and simpler of Shakespeare's sonnets, the one that starts with the line, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" No, I do different things with the sonnet. Sometimes I play with some words there. Sometimes I play with the general persona or voice and change it around. So this one is called is also titled "Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day," and this contains some lines tweeted or spoken by by this famous global leader, world leader. I shall compare it to a miracle. It's here now, but will be gone by April. From 5 to 0, said an oracle, I trust on Foxy News. I have this skill and understand this virus a little. Just take a pill of this gobbledygook and stay away from yes, Chinese spittle. Do you know I'm #1 on Facebook? Just wait until the eye of heaven shines. It is a bug that's killed by summer's heat. 100,000 dead by June, that's fine. It's still a great success, yes, quite a feat. Something I'm sure my voters will remember and make us great again in November. Uh, well, not all voters remember, thankfully. uh, okay, I will move on to something that happened closer to us. And this is based on the sonnet that starts with the line, my tongue-tied muse in manners holds her still. My tongue is tied, we kept your folk curfew. To others' praise of you we added more. And now we are tracking home as asked to do. I'm sorry, I'll read it again because I got disoriented. Okay. My tongue-tied muse in manners holds her still. My tongue is tied, we kept your folk curfew. To others' praise of you we added more. And now we are trekking home as asked to do, with almost no cash or food in its store. I silently fear we'll surely be dead if this coronavirus thing us spares. With no employment we will starve instead. I turn around to see how my wife fares. She bears our youngest daughter on her back. We cannot rest or stop, that much we know. I carry all our possessions in a sack. We have about 600 miles to go. On balconies, the middle classes stand, and from a safe distance, give us a hand. Uh, I'll read just one more, the last one, which actually takes an idea that I had worked into a shorter story as as my first effort to tackle what was happening around us. Recently, I have written a piece in the Hindu, which just came out. I think this has just come out, in which I also talk about all this pandemic literature that we are coming across and that I have myself contributed to, and I point out how, to some extent, it reflects our own relative safety. The fact that we belong to the kind of classes that could draw its head into the carapace of a lockdown, which was not the case with a lot of other people. So even though I have contributed to it, I have done it with a degree of doubt, a degree of even guilt, in the sense that I can do this. But then, I mean, we all do what we can and what we feel we should. Um, So one of the first contribution I had was part of something called Decameron 2020, started by the well-known Italian writer Eri De Luca, and that he invited writers to contribute short texts on lockdowns or their reactions to it, and then well-known actors were asked to performed them, taped them, and they were put on YouTube as separate texts. In my case, I was lucky to get the brilliant Shabana Azmi to read out my shortest story. And the idea in that shortest story is similar to the idea in the last sonnet of this collection. And as I pointed out, this collection, the profit from it and all my royalties went to a migrant labor organization. This one is based on Shakespeare's sonnet that starts with, "Tired with all these, for restful death I cry." Tired of people, for proper life we prayed. And then suddenly it happened, a quiet fell upon earth. We saw pollution fade, and hardly any human was in sight. At first we hesitated, and then the trees, filled with birds, the public squares with bird songs. We occupied the parks in Japanese cities. The Sika deer promenaded in throngs, and prides of lions settled on canyon roads. And seals on docks and whales swam close to shore. And towns belonged to hares and bears and goats. But now this too has passed into our lore. As chimneys spew poison as in the past, I tell my pups it was too good to last. Uh, this, of course, is my warning against what might come. Back to normal, back to thoughtless production. And having read that out, I'll go back and read out the poem that Jaideep has requested me to read out, which is Amma. Amma was what we call, in my family, we call my Dadi, my paternal grandmother, because I think my father's generation used to call her Amma, so we call her Amma too, and we had to call our mothers Ammi, Mummy, and all the rest. Okay, Amma. Down the stairs of this house where plaster flakes and falls, through the intimate emptiness of its rooms and hall, I hear your slow footsteps, grandmother, echo or pause. As they used to through long summer afternoons spent within the watered down four walls of husk and fragile drinks of ice, mango, or lemon, the circle of watermelon crescents. Slowly you shuffle, examining each new tear in the curtains, which will have to be mended when the first monsoon rain provides a respite from sun, curtails the need for shade. Slowly on arthritic joints you move from room to room, marking the damage of the years, evaluating how soon the past will collapse or how long the present lasts. You never need glasses to mark the contours of your house. Though you can't see grandsons at a distance, once wore a blouse inside out. Nothing has changed, grandmother, no, not yet. Though your collected steps never turn the corner into you. In a starched and white sari, the fragrance of soap around you, and all the curtains have long been taken down. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful, Tabish. Wonderful,
Thank you.
wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you so much. That, I mean, we could go on. We could keep on listening. I mean, that was what I felt. We could just go on listening. I mean, it's been such wonderful experience to listen to your poems, and you have been you read from your earliest work, and so we kind of get to see your work as a poet through. I mean, for most for people who have not read or are not aware of your work, but this has been really wonderful. And I was just wondering about the various kind of texts and intertexts that keep weaving into your work. And even when you were speaking about poetry, you did speak about how one needs to keep reading poetry, reading other works, the older poets as well as contemporary ones. And I was just thinking about the various kind of influence, the various kind of texts. I mean, even in a poem which is where you speak about the Anderson story, the Tinder Box, you bring in Wordsworth, and I just love that way where you bring in the shades of a prison house into that work as well. And I mean, I just what struck me when I was listening to these poems, which were influenced or which were kind of takeoff from Anderson, where you bring in contemporary events, events which are happening when you are writing. I mean, these are just, we always initially look at them as fairy tales, as children's work, but you're talking about the Iraq war, you're talking about the refugee, and I found them really wonderful. Thank you so much for reading these poems, and thank you for reading the quarantine poems. And I was just wondering, you stopped at 21. I mean, I think you have the quarantine period of 21 days in mind when
Exactly.
you decided to just write 21 poems. But this is brilliant. Thank you so much. We are now open to questions, comments, and as Tabish said right at the beginning, it would be
Yeah.
nice if you could key in your questions in the chat box, and he will continue answering. So please.
Yeah, and I can see that you have been posting things in the chat box. I can also see that Malashri ji have joined us, and I could see a message early on by Gillian Dooley, I think. Yeah, yeah. So thank you. And I mean, I'm just mentioning people I've met before, I've known. I mean, obviously, I cannot see the entire. I don't have the entire gallery view, so there can be other people I know. I just haven't seen your face or your name yet. But thank you for that, and thank you for your appreciation. Sure. Yeah, please go ahead. If you have any questions or any remarks, I can see there's a message from Dr. Naushad Khan. Yeah, but yeah, that's just an introduction. But yeah, any questions or anything like that?
So what's next after the quarantine sonnets, if I may? I mean,
I don't know. I mean, what would be next? What I would really want to do is be able to go on halftime, in the sense that I would really like to have time to read and maybe write. I mean, read freely. Of course, I read a lot to teach, but it's like a stuff that I've already read before in most cases, and so that's what I would like to know. I've been working on a novel, which is actually it's a weird story because I started it 3 or 4 years back, and it was about actually based. I was reading a lot of popular fiction around that time, popular science around that time, and this was based on certain ideas that I had about evolution, and it featured microbes. And then I wrote about 140 pages, and like 2 or 3 other manuscripts, I lost track, and I put it away. But then, of course, when this pandemic happened, I took a look at it again, and then I started writing it again. So I'm trying to finish it. I think I'll finish it. I don't know how good it will be, but I'll finish it. That's what I'm doing at the moment.
great.
Rajshri Singh has addressed. There's a question from Madhu Srivastav. How did you think of relating fairy tales with contemporary issues? That's an interesting question. I mean, there are two answers to it. First of all, as Nishi pointed out, I mean, we read them as fairy tales, but it's doubtful that H.C. Anderson wrote them as fairy tales, in the sense that he wrote them as stories. So but that's the smaller answer. The bigger answer is that every time you read fairy tales, what you notice most of all is how acutely, and sometimes in a very complicated way, they comment on the world out there. In the ages, the fears, the hopes, the dangers, and so many other matters. I mean, there have of course been very serious studies on fairy tales too, especially mostly from a psychological perspective. But I also find them quite interesting the way they comment on not just psychological elements, but also other elements. So I've always seen fairy tales as much more serious, the word serious can be used, because I think the word serious is misused very often, and it's not necessarily a good or a bad word. But I would say I've seen fairy tales as not just entertainment, and that's what made me reach out and look at H.C. Anderson's stories along those lines. I must say I made no effort to read them in a contemporary way. These readings just came to me. I've never written poems that quickly in my entire life. I just thought of H.C. Anderson, and I could thought of a certain way in which his fairy tales could be read. Of course, I've read H.C. Anderson 2 or 3 times. So I mean, I read H.C. Anderson a long time back. Then I read H.C. Anderson out to my children, and in this period, my children were growing up. My older children were growing up, so I had the H.C. Anderson fresh in my mind. Okay, I can see other questions. You have to give me some time to go up, because I am digitally challenged, and
We all are. We all are.
not my students, not my kids. Sometimes I feel it would be nice to have one of my children sit here and do these things for me. They would never sit through any of my readings. That would be sheer torture.
They are a smart generation coming up now. They are smarter.
My older daughter once told me, and my son reads a lot of literature. He's a science guy. He's been winning science competitions here and all that, but he reads a lot of literature. My older daughter is more a sociology kind of person. She reads literature too. But the only time my daughter read one of my novels, and this is of course 5 6 years ago. She's 16 now, so she's just 11 12 then. She read some of it, translated into Danish. Yeah. And then she told me, Pa, what you need to do is let me tell you the stories, because you just make your things a bit too difficult. You're never going to make much money. You let me tell you the story, then you write them down. Then you'll make money. Good question again. Gillian has asked me, is it very different writing fiction from writing poetry? Yes, definitely, Gillian. I mean, for me, it's completely different. And I would even say, I would not say fiction from poetry. I would say long fiction. Long fiction, I find easier to do with my other activities, because maybe it's a bit more diffuse and it allows you to go away and come back. With shorter stories and poems, I feel that if you go away long enough without finishing enough to work on, of course, you revise and revise and revise, but with shorter stories and poems, I feel that you have to get enough done there, written down. Then you can revise it 50 times. That's fine. But you need that. You need that that basic material down on paper. With novels, I feel that I can write 40 pages, go back, and then get busy for 2 months, go back, start reading it again from page 1 and go on to page 40 and write another 50 pages and get distracted. So in that sense, I think long fiction and these shorter, more condensed forms are definitely different for me.
There's just one question before Gillian, which asks about the intertextuality in your poems. Any particular reason why there is so much of an intertextuality in your poetry?
I cannot find that question. Basically,
just before Gillian's.
Okay. Okay. Basically, intertextuality in my poetry.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't go about thinking of intertextuality in an academic manner. I mean, I have no intention of being intertextual, but I do feel that all literature in some ways is intertextual. I mean, no one creates, we are not like spiders creating our webs out of ourselves. We are working with things out there, and then we are, of course, adding things to it. And because that's the way I see all of literature, when I start doing it, if I feel that there are things that need to be taken, I kind of like making it obvious to the reader too, because I feel it gives the reader a different way to read. You're reading not just one text, but two texts, and you're reading the space in between. So in some ways, it also enables me to say more than I would have been able to say just on my own. So that might be the reason why very often I feel tempted to move towards what academics would call intertextuality, but which, as I said, which I see as just being familiar with the with as many of the tiles on that magic wall as possible so that I can make a little space for my own little tile.
Thank you. There's one question in case you've missed it because we've got quite a lot of comments there. This is from Rajashri Singh, who says that she's a young, struggling poet and she really wants to understand how you manage to put the works from multiple centuries together. Yeah, because you mentioned one volume of poems where you bring in Kalidasa's Shakuntala, some of your poems. You have transcriptions of Ghalib's ghazals in the same volume, and we have Anderson as well. So,
I mean, to be honest, I don't really put them together in the same section. So they're in different sections. But of course, I make them all of them contemporary in some ways, especially the Kalidas and the H.C. Anderson. Ghalib, I transcreate. But Kalidas, for instance, I turn into something called fragments from the cognition of Shakuntala, which is basically the story of a small town, middle class Indian girl becoming an immigrant. And in the process, she, in some ways, loses aspects of her, let's say, I wouldn't call it identity, but of her, yeah, maybe the word Hindi assistive would be better than identity, in the sense. And I use that the notion of a ring, the ring that is lost, that is eaten up by a fish and has to be recovered before the king can remember. But in this case, the ring is like a passport. It's like a letter of admission to a first world university, and I play with those things. So I do make it contemporary. But Ghalib, I transcreate, and I transcreate Ghalib by sometimes moving his shares around. So in the original version, if the shares are listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I might have 1, 2, and 5, or I might have 5, 1, 5, and then 2, 3. And I do that to bring out a certain aspect of it. Now, yeah, but mostly it's transcreation. For instance, if I may read out just one of the smallest ones. Yeah, if you this one, Hadar Khwaishein aisi ki har khwahish pe dam nikle. And here I've moved things around a bit, left out a share too. But this is how Ghalib's, the lines I've translated run. Hazar ख्वाहिशें ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश पे दम निकले, बहुत निकले मेरे अरमान लेकिन फिर भी कम निकले. खुदा के वास्ते पर्दा ना काबे का उठा वाइज, कहीं ऐसा न हो यहाँ भी वही काफिर सनम निकले. कहाँ मैं खाना का दरवाजा गालिब और कहाँ वाइज, पर इतना जानते हैं कल वो जाता था कि हम निकले. And here in my translation too, you can see I've turned them around. For God's sake, leave the Kaaba's veil alone. There too may lie hidden a god of a stone. The preacher, should he know the den of wine? And yet I passed him there unchaperoned. 1,000 wishes and each worth a life. So much achieved, but fulfillment unknown. So I hope that gives you an idea of how I try to do it. I can see Jaydeep has a question. Do you see any particular contemporary European poet influence you, whom you read again and again? If by contemporary you mean living poets, I must say that I read poetry in translation, but not that much. And when it comes to contemporary poets, of course there are lots of dead poets I read in translation, but when it comes to living poets in writing in English, yeah, definitely. I think not European in this case because she's Canadian, but Anne Carson, especially the books she was publishing about 10 years back or so, Beauty of the Husband, the red essay, the glass essay, and so on and so forth. I think I've found them fascinating, and I've gone back and read them and reread them. But also people like, say, Tony Harrison, who is still alive, as far as I know. So there are people like that, but they are English, American, Canadian, Indian. So when it comes to translated work from French or Russian or Spanish, which I mean, I have read lots of these famous dead poets from these languages, but I cannot really claim that I've read enough living poets, and that might also be because uh, poetry takes longer to get translated. There's less money in it. You need to be dead and achieve some kind of renown before actually it starts getting translated, and or at least translated in a visible way. So that might be the reason. I mean, I have read some in anthologies or in, in poetry magazines, but then that doesn't stay because you need to have a whole collection before you stay, then before you can really be influenced. I can see there are lots of questions. I'm taking too long to answer your questions.
I mean, we could go on because there are quite a number of questions in the chat box.
Yeah, I think I just moved. Okay, now I'm having trouble moving down properly. Let's see what I can do. Yeah, this is better. Okay, good. And this is how do you overcome writer's block? This is a very good question, but I'm a very bloody-minded writer. And the reason for that is that I think writing as a kind of praxis. Now, this is slightly misleading, so I'll give you a different image. See, when you write, basically you're doing what you do in real life. You're using language, okay? You're using language in certain ways, and you're engaging with reality using language in certain ways. And of course, that distinguishes literature, those ways. Um, but you're doing something that you do in ordinary life. It's a bit like in ordinary life you walk, but if you want to be a good runner, you obviously need to have some technique. The experts will tell you what to do with your shoulder, what to do with your arm, and of course you have to eat in a certain way and exercise in a certain way, and all that. But finally, you're going to be a good runner only if you start running. And that's why that's the way I look at literature. Finally, the only way to learn literature is to sit down and start writing, and be open to abandoning things, to changing things, to revising things, and go on. That's what I mean by being bloody-minded. So I don't really have a writer's block that's significant. I have a writer's block of a different sort where other things in my life interfere. And then I cannot do any writing because there are other worries. But it's not a writer's block of the writer kind, in the sense that because I basically figure it out by doing it, and that's it. Okay. Again, there's a question from Sanjay Kumar Pushka. Writing poetry is expression of inner self vividly reflected. Yes and no, because it depends very much on what you mean by inner self. I don't believe that there is any inner self that is isolated from any outer self. I think there's always a relationship, and obviously you're working on this relationship. You're writing about things, even if you're writing about something that is totally external, you are doing it as yourself. So your inner self is involved. And even if you're writing about something that's totally internal, you're still doing it using language, which is not entirely internal. It wouldn't be language. It's always shared by other people, has already gone through various meanings, whether various conflicts, and using language. So that itself makes any internal engagement external too. And there are other reasons too. So I never feel it as an internal external matter. I feel it as a negotiation, as an interface. But of course, there are poets who see poetry as a very personal thing, and that's fine with me too. Uh, also, I do think that what literature does, as the Korean German philosopher Byung-Chul Han puts it, and he's a brilliant philosopher writing about certain things that concern us today. what literature does is demand contemplation. But contemplation is not something that secludes you. Contemplation is actually an engagement with everything around you, through you, an engagement with difference, with otherness, and so on and so forth. So for me, that's how it works. By the way, Sanjay Kumarji, I realize you are from my old university, assistant professor there.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, good to meet you. we have to get together and have a cup of chai when I'm in Gaya next.
Sure, sir. Sure, sir. Please.
Okay, there's a, oh, okay, it jumped. I'm trying to answer.
There's a question from Basho PD. Do you find academic writing overlapping with your creative writing?
Now I do, definitely. I mean, there was a period when I actually found it quite useful because it enabled me to read and think in ways that maybe I would not have done. But I kind of feel that now I've been doing that for 25 years, starting with my PhD, so, or 23, 24 years, something like that, 23 years or so. And I kind of feel that I've had enough. For instance, I really cannot read academic theory anymore. I know it's fine, and I'm very happy other people are writing it, but I just cannot do it. I've had enough of it, and I do feel that theory interferes with my creative writing. A certain kind of theory is still useful, but academic theory becomes very problematic because it's too close to it depends too much on pinning things down with terminology and jargon and all the rest. And I feel that one thing that literature does in language is by exploring things that cannot be communicated, cannot be pinned down in language. Literature for me works not just with language as transparency, as communication, but with the gaps of language, the silences, the noises. And I think that is exactly what academic theory, which is sometimes different from, say, philosophy or theoretical physics for that matter, which academic theory does not allow. It pins down things too much, and I find it interfering with my thinking, if not my writing.
Very
One question
good evening,
from
sir.
Sunil. There's one question from Sunil Bhandari, which says you were born in Gaya and Denmark is where you now spend time. So how much influence do places have on your writing?
Yeah, I think we are all influenced by what we experience. I mean, my first 25 years were spent in Gaya. And I would say that the first 25 years are your formative years in many ways. But then now I have been in Denmark close to that many years. I mean, there was a period when I was in Delhi. And again, Delhi, I think because I was there for 5-6 years, has definitely influenced me in many ways. I mean, my experiences in Delhi definitely, or my friends in Delhi. But very often I do not think that these influences are contradictory or problematic. I think very often they build on things which are already in place. I mean, when I was in Gaya, I was a small town person, but I was also in my own ways, despite all the weaknesses that I would have had, my areas of ignorance, which might have been removed a bit with further experience. Despite all that, I was a cosmopolitan person. I was not a metropolitan person, but I was a cosmopolitan person, and so was my close friends. We were people who were interested in the world and other things and difference. We were people who did not like imposing final solutions on other people. We were people who were concerned about life in the world, and those things have not changed. I mean, they just grew. I just started relating with them in a different context. So I don't see it as a contradiction. I feel that they can help you grow in different ways. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe one last question. This is a question on annotations. I mean, what is your take? This is a question by Yamini. What is your take on annotations to poems for the ones that are far removed from common parlance?
Okay. Oh yeah, Yamini Shah. Thank you for the question. I know we have met Good for you to be there. That's again another person I know. Rashri Singh has a question too before that. So
yes.
I'll answer both of them. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Rashri Singh first, because that's the first question. How do you manage to stick with your original thought and not get dissuaded, especially in the course of writing long prose? Good question. and what I'll tell you is, by long prose, I mean not academic prose or essays, because there I have a fairly clear idea. I mean, I want to start writing an academic paper or non-prose essay without a clear idea. Okay, so I have a very clear idea, and I continue with that, and I work it out. I change things, I express myself better, I look up other things, but the basic notion is there. But when it comes to, say, long fiction, I think the point comes, of course, you know what you're going to do to some extent, but you haven't worked out everything, and I don't think you should work out everything. Because, for instance, a significant character in a certain context. Now, you worked out various things about this character and about the context, but if the story grows, the character might change too. The character might try to slip your grasp. And your relationship to that character is similar to your relationship to other people in real life. It has to be a relationship of respect. You have every right to insist that a character do things the way you want the character to do these things. But you also have to listen to the character, because sometimes maybe the character is developing in ways that are good for the story, for the novel. And then you have to change your mind and redo certain things. So that's how I look at it.
Sir, I am Dr. Naushad speaking, sir.
Yeah. Hello?
Assalamu alaikum, sir. I have one question also that I posted about the translation while I am translating of the Ghalib's
I didn't see your
ghazals.
Can you post it again, please? Can you
Yeah,
post it again?
I have posted the answer. So one side news about the Rizwan Bhai. Have you heard about the Rizwan Bhai?
How do I write about?
No. Have you heard about the Rizwan Khan, the chairman of the Aligarh Muslim University?
Oh yeah, okay. No, the head of department
Yeah, he's not okay. He's in the Apollo, sir. He's Apollo. He's sick. He's unwell.
He's what?
He is in the Apollo, New Delhi Apollo Hospital. He is not well, and
Oh, I didn't know that.
he got some problem.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, I'll get in touch with him. I know him from a long time back. I'll get in
Yes,
touch
sir.
with him. Thank you for telling me. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Naushad, head of the department, Sokhra College, Bihar Sharif, Magad University. Now it is in the Patliputra University, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Nashad. Hopefully, we'll get to meet when I'm in Patna sometime.
Please, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for telling me. I'll get in touch with Rizwan Bhai.
Please, because he has some problems in the maybe some serious problem. He's hospitalized in the Apollo Hospital.
Definitely, I'll get in touch with him immediately after this. Thank you.
Please, sir. My question. I have posted my question about the Ghalib's. You said the translation.
Okay. I'll just answer Yamini Shah first, and then if you have a question, you can just post it, because I don't think I can find it again going back.
Okay, sir. Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. What is your take on annotations to poems for the ones far removed from common parlance, in the sense of footnotes or explanatory words? That's what you mean, don't you? Like
references to different mythologies, theories, ideas, cultural nuances.
Yeah. I think that's very much that depends on the translator and the editor and the readership one has in mind. I mean, because I don't translate as a translator. I work as a creative writer. If I had that, and that's why I don't claim that I am translating, I say I'm transcreating. So if I had that problem, I would probably rewrite around it. I would change things so that the essence of that meaning gets across to this new readership. But that is, of course, not what a translator would do. So I think it depends very much on the kind of person who is working with it.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tabish. It has been a pleasure listening to you, talking about your poetry, reading your poems, and thank you to our wonderful audience who've joined us on Zoom for all your insightful questions. This has been a fantastic discussion and an evening. And I see the little one. I see Alice peeping a little bit, and she's moved away just now. Hello. So before we end this program, I would request Amita Roy, who is an executive member of the Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library and who has retired as an associate professor in English, who is herself a poet, short story writer, and translator, to please deliver the formal vote of thanks. Amita Di.
Thank you, Nishi. It has been an absolutely fantastic evening of poetry and discussion. It is my proud privilege to deliver the vote of thanks.
Amita Di, could you put on your video, please?
Sorry. Yes, it's okay, Nishi?
Yes. Perfect.
Thank you. It is my proud privilege to deliver the vote of thanks to this engaging session of Indian poetry, session number 7 in a row of IPPL. We had been listening to the great voice of a prolific writer, Tabish Khair. I heartily thank Tabish Khair for being with us today, reflecting on the way you feel about poetry, you think about poetry, the creative process which make your art, especially especially poetry writing, so endearing and stimulating. And thank you also, sir, for the rendition of your remarkable poem, The Quarantine Sonnet, and especially the last one, Amma. I really loved it. My heartfelt thanks to Bashubi Fraser, Professor Bashubi Fraser, who plays a pivotal role in shaping IPPL, for being with us, not just today, I think almost all the sessions that we have been having around, and whose endearing presence inspires us immensely. I thank also Professor Malashri Lal, who has joined us today, and we always look forward to your support and inspiration. A huge thanks to Nishi Pulugartha and Jaideep Saringi for coordinating today's program so wonderfully. Next, I thank all members of the advisory committee, the respected Keki Daruwala, and all the IPPL members and Facebook Live viewers for being with us in this session. Be with us always, and do keep on encouraging us. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. And I thank all of you for finding time and joining me. And I thank Jaideep and Nishi and the organization for organizing this. It's always great to get back to India.
Thank you so much. Thank you. See you again in our next programs. Have a nice day.